So welcome back, and to today's session. This one is called Planting a Seed. So today we're going to be getting a bit more creative and thinking about the kinds of things we can use to inspire our active imagination practice. So the seed is a very important part of the overall process, and it is, as it sounds, the source of material we use as the initial inspiration for the exercise we're doing. So when we begin an active imagination session, we're generally not just sitting down or lying down and allowing anything to happen without any point of reference. Usually we use what's known as a seed. And so the seed is a very apt metaphor because it's not its full expression. It has more hidden within it for us to learn, for us to observe and interact with. And it contains the germ of our development. So we're going to be looking at what some of the thinkers on this subject have said, not least Jung, but also Robert Johnson. And I'm also going to be giving my own take on the various kinds of seeds that can be used. And so before we get down to practice today, I'm also going to ask you to think of what seed you would like to use today once we've talked about the various options that are available. So generally speaking, when we do active imagination, we know why we're doing what we're doing. We've got some kind of seed, some kind of inspiration for doing it. Occasionally, it can, of course, happen spontaneously. This is something that both Jung and Johnson do talk about. However, most of the time, because we're doing it in a rather structured way, and that might be, we're going to see in a moment whether we're talking about reactive seeds or proactive seeds, but either way, it's generally not spontaneous. It does happen on occasion, but most of the time, our practice will consist of deliberate and choiceful active imagination. So in all of those instances, we're going to need a seed. So let's move forward and see what some of the thinkers have said on this subject. So in 1946, in one of Jung's letters to his client, Mr. O, he said that in regards to active imagination, he said, look, the point is that you start with any image. For instance, just with that yellow mass in your dream. Now, this client of Jung's had actually dreamt about a yellow mass. He's not speaking figuratively here, really. He's actually saying, look, go to your dream, start with that dream. And it's almost like he's saying, just start with anything. Of course, it does matter what we start with. It will affect the outcome of the exercise and whatever progress and whatever insights we come to. But at the same time, there's no such thing as a bad seed. There's no such thing as an arbitrary dream object. Everything that appears symbolically for us, not least in dreams, has some kind of corollary in the unconscious mind, has some kind of meaning for us. So it does matter to an extent what you start with, but in the case of this particular client, Mr. O, who, if you read the letters that Jung sent him, it sounds like he was somewhat resistant to doing anything by way of active imagination. So Jung is sort of saying, just start with something. And if you're ever not sure what to do, how to start one of these exercises, then starting with some dream material is a pretty good place. Likewise, starting with a feeling or an emotion is an equally great place to start. We're going to be coming on to that in a couple of minutes here. Jung goes on and says, and therewith, you gradually create the unity of conscious and unconscious, without which there is no individuation at all. Remember what we're doing here. We're bringing together two aspects or more aspects of our own mind, of which one is unconscious and one is, of course, conscious. And this is actually a very Hegelian idea, as in the philosopher Georg Hegel. Now, Jung didn't speak about Hegel much, but he's actually a very key philosopher, and the whole German idealist movement is something that has very much fed into my work and is very relevant to this whole process of individuation, yes, of developing self-knowledge. So we won't go into depth in that now, of course, but the idea is very relevant because what we're not doing is trying to overcome the unconscious or allow it to overcome us, but find that truth that defines them both. So Hegel actually said that the truth is found in a synthesis of the two, of the conscious thesis and the unconscious antithesis. So there's always going to be some kind of resistance involved in this because we're coming up against a part of ourselves that is misaligned from, or maybe even contrary to our conscious position. So that's why there's energetic tension. That's why there's effort involved. It's one reason there's effort involved. And that's why there's progress that's achieved in enduring and working through that tension. So moving on now to the next slide. Some tips here from Jung. He didn't offer much by way of advice on how to do active imagination, at least not in his writing. In fact, in that same letter to Mr. O, Jung actually says that active imagination is a far too difficult subject for him to deal with before a merely intellectual public. So make of that what you will. No, we're going to talk about it. So I would hope that firstly, if you've made it this far, you're not taking merely an intellectual interest in this. Practice is by far and away the most important part. But it is also important that we talk about it and try and understand it. And secondly, it just corroborates this idea that, look, Jung didn't really talk about this much in his writing. He didn't really give much by way of actual instruction. Much of what he did give seems to be in his letters to people written relatively late in his life. So nonetheless, despite it being one of the most powerful techniques there is, the most powerful technique for, in his words, reducing the production of the unconscious, he says here, he must make the emotional state the basis or starting point of the procedure. So clearly the emotional state is a primary starting point for this. But the emotional state can also be represented by a symbol or in a pattern or a projection that we're experiencing. So we're going to be looking at a system for how we can actually break this down in a couple of minutes here. But for now, just note that Jung is saying, make the emotional state the seed of your practice. He goes on, he must make himself as conscious as possible of the mood he is in, sinking himself in without reserve. So this is key, very important, becoming extremely aware of how it is you feel. So this is what I refer to as bare attention, and also the exercises facing the feeling and the emotional integration meditation. These are ways of really directing your attention to the feeling. And this is actually something we can do at the very start of the exercise as well. In meditation, there can be elements of that, even though in basic meditation, we're generally focusing on a physical object like the sensation of the breath. What that tends to do is make way for the presenting content that's there, usually the feeling, to come to the surface. So a lot of our challenges, are rooted in the very fact that we're not aware of how we feel. We habitually try to push it away and avoid it and lunge at all kinds of coping mechanisms, even just maybe a general busyness or a general franticness. And so much can be solved just by practicing the art of facing up to feeling, doing it on a daily basis, doing it on a momentary basis, but doing it also in a dedicated basis where we're actually devoting all of our attention and focus in that moment through meditation, through active imagination, even through divination, to experiencing what it is that's trying to come up. So Jung goes on, fantasy must be allowed the freest possible play, yet not in such a manner that it leaves the orbit of its object, namely the affect. Right, so we allow the unconscious to do whatever it needs to do. However, never to the point where it leaves the orbit of its object. This is the seed. So the seed is always like this central point of reference around which the activity develops. So much the same way as an acorn, the seed of an oak tree, can grow into an oak tree and it can reveal itself through that process. In much the same way, the seed of our active imagination, which is a conscious component that has this vast unconscious corollary to it, it never leaves the orbit of that seed, in this case the affect, so the emotion. So this differentiates it from things like Freudian reassociation, where we just go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And that can be very useful. I mean, how can that not tell us something about the state and the nature of our own mind? But that wouldn't be active imagination because it's not revolving around this initial seed. This is where the conscious mind plays a very key role. This is how it can actually do its part to communicate with the unconscious mind. Consciously, we say, okay, I know there is this symbol, there is this feeling, there is this dream image, or there is this addiction that I have, or this pattern that's emerging. And that's only the very tip of the iceberg. That's only merely a seed, and it contains wisdom and insights. And it's going to require me to face it bravely and apply some energy there. Consciously, I don't know what it means yet, but I can say for sure that it contains something. And I can work with my unconscious mind to reveal what that might be. This is that unity of both we talked about. So let's move on to what Robert Johnson had to say about this. He said, "We often have something vague and invisible in the unconscious that bothers us. We can feel the conflict just below the surface, but we can't see what is going on. We can't associate it with anything specific or concrete. We feel the effect, but otherwise it is so vague and formless that we can't get a handle on it. When this happens, you can go to the unconscious in your imagination and ask the unseen content to personify itself." Beautiful, right? And it sounds so simple. And it is simple in principle. But just knowing that there is this ability, we have this imagination, we have this capacity to do this. And yes, it's built on an understanding of the nature of mind. And if we don't have that kind of, even a basic model of how our minds really work and the concept of the unconscious mind, then this can feel a bit like an unintuitive or even strange thing to be doing. But as William Blake said, as I keep coming back to this quote, the imagination is not a state, it is the human existence itself. This is a distinctly human capability, and we do well to use it. So whatever your problem is, whatever your challenge or hang-up is, some mysterious, painful feeling, we can all relate to this, carrying around some kind of sadness or anger or depression or craving for something, we can actually talk to ourselves, our many selves, and we can understand where it's coming from. It's not a 5-minute job. We must come up against the energy of resistance, and we do not necessarily control the process or determine how it's going to unfold. How could we? Because the conscious mind is just one actor in this conversation. So we have to, in order to be successful, come at it with both confidence and humility, knowing that we can find the answers, but at the same time knowing that we not only don't know everything about ourselves, but maybe we cannot know everything about ourselves right now, and that there's a natural unfolding that has to happen here. Through our efforts and through the cooperation of the unconscious mind, we will get to the answers when we need to. And when we don't, that's just more feedback. There's still insight there. There's still feedback about the nature of our minds. Even when it doesn't go the way we expect, most certainly when it doesn't go the way we expect, but also when it doesn't go the way that feels satisfying to us. Having a very satisfying experience has tremendous value. There can be great insight and there can be great emotional release. But we need not judge the unsatisfying experiences as any less useful. They're just as useful. Every experience is useful. This whole process of individuation and coming to know ourselves is predicated on this understanding that every experience is useful and reflective of something in ourselves. So, with that all said, I'm going to move to my own system here. I'm just going to briefly go through this because I go through this in a lot more detail in the courses that I'm about to publish, not least the shadow work course, but also the active imagination course as well. It's called How to Talk to Yourself. And so what I've listed here are what I call the 5 elements and the 5 manifestations of shadow. So shadow being that part of the unconscious mind that we find difficult to confront in ourselves. So not all unconscious material is shadow, but all shadow material is unconscious or has some unconscious element. Of course, we can interface with it in the unconscious mind where it appears symbolically. So in that sense, technically speaking, there's a part of it that's conscious, but it's really the symbol we're seeing is bridging that gap between our conscious selves and the unconscious. That's why it's called a symbol. Symbol means to throw together. So I've broken these down into the 5 elements and the 5 manifestations. All of these can potentially be used as seeds, or at least as inspiration for what kinds of seeds you can use. So first of all, the 5 elements of shadow, otherwise known as the 5 ingredients. These are things that we can merely only deduce through their manifestations, through how they show up in our experience, or just through logical deduction. So for example, traits. If you know that you have a preference for thinking, then you can deduce that some element of feeling, and indeed thinking, is going to remain in the shadow. But certainly the opposite of however you like to show up is going to be more unconscious than your preference. And it's important to say here, actually, that these 5 elements and 5 manifestations are not intended to be a fully comprehensive system or map of the unconscious mind. They're more intended to be a practical tool for understanding what to do about unconscious material. So moving on here, emotions, key one, we've just seen the quotes from Jung and Johnson on that. Beliefs. So beliefs is something that's more likely to become apparent through insight, through active imagination. There might be occasions when you can use beliefs as a seed, but generally it's going to probably be that we become aware of something in the unconscious mind that we believed, that we had no idea that we believed. Archetypes, of course. If you've seen the playlist on the Make It Conscious YouTube channel, a lot of those exercises use archetypes as the seed, and it can be very useful for engaging with those in a proactive way. There's often overlap here, so if we have a certain emotion, we end up speaking with a certain archetype in our practice. And at the same time, we can proactively decide to engage with a certain archetype if we know that we have challenges relating to that archetype, or if the relationship needs working on. So importantly here, you can use this in both a proactive way, where we're saying, okay, I know I have a challenge with this, or I know that this is something that waits for me to deal with. I can approach that now as part of my daily practice or regular practice. But we can also use it in a responsive way. So this is largely how Jung and Johnson refer to it. Responsive is doing it in response to whatever is presenting itself. And so the whole technique is often postulated as a way to engage with that content that is just below the threshold of consciousness, that has the most chance of erupting into conscious awareness and maybe even taking control of our circumstances or even our behavior. So that's often traditionally been thought of as the primary use of active imagination, at least in a Jungian sense. But it's not a new technique in terms of like engaging with the unconscious mind is certainly nothing new. It's always been possible to do that both proactively, in a very structured way, but also in a responsive way to whatever's presenting itself. So the 5 manifestations now, dream material or anything from the imagination, if you honestly and sincerely go into active imagination using any dream image, you're bound to come away with some kind of insight. So projections now, another manifestation of shadow or of the unconscious mind. Projections don't have to be shadow material by any means. They could well be things that we know and understand about ourselves and are nonetheless seeing in the world as well. But if ever we see that there's a theme where we see the same traits or similar behavior in other individuals in the world, or even in phenomena. So I'm reminded here of one of my subscribers who recently commented that in an exercise, he saw a lantern, which by itself is very symbolic. But then in daily life, later the same day, he found a toy lantern under his child's bed. So, very interesting synchronicity. And that is a kind of projection because, of course, the lantern is really an inner lantern and holds some symbolic value. So the next step is to engage with the lantern and see where it leads him, or hold the lantern and walk into the darkness and see what it reveals. So this can also be a kind of projection and a useful seed for active imagination practice. Patterns can be whether short-term addictive patterns, whether it's addiction to cigarettes or chocolate cake, or longer-term cyclical patterns where we're encountering similar kinds of people, similar kinds of traits or behaviors, whether literal or symbolic. Again, very useful material for instigating a practice. Somatic is anything relating to the body. So curious pains, chronic pain and discomfort especially. There's always some kind of psychological component to these experiences, to these symptoms. And active imagination is a very insightful way to understand not only where it came from, but what it actually holds for us as well, because these conditions often actually contain real treasure. And it's actually that they're, generally speaking, trying to get us back on an authentic path. And so something is flagging up that we've either come off track or the thesis we've been living by no longer works. We have to elevate to the next stage and synthesize. Lastly here, aversions. So clearly this is anything we're repulsed by, anything we find particularly displeasing. And this is always telling us something about ourselves as well. It's not saying that there isn't some truth in what we're seeing at all. But this can be anything from severe injustice with real understandable roots in why we might feel that way about a certain person or a certain type of behavior, all the way up to, say, phobias. And there's no such thing as an irrational phobia. There may be such thing as an unuseful phobia that maybe served a purpose at one point in time or in our ancestral history, but no longer serves us now. So it doesn't mean it's irrational. Often what appears to be irrational is just outdated and misaligned. And again, it's a very Hegelian idea, what it means to be rational. Everything is rational ultimately, but in its isolated form, it can certainly be irrational or appear irrational. Okay, so I'm now going to invite you to choose a seed for today's guided exercise. You can start with a feeling, whatever's coming up for you right now. Are you conscious of how you feel right now? Whether it's something painful or pleasant. Both can be useful sources of inspiration here. If there's nothing especially obvious, you might go to a recent dream, particularly one that still holds an emotional charge. If you know that you tend to lean one way or another in terms of how you see the world or how you make decisions in the world, how about trying out the opposite? Can you personify that in the practice? Any physical pain, or any pattern or addiction you've become aware of, just take a moment or two to choose a seed for today's session. And when you're ready, just making sure you're comfortable. And closing your eyes. You can safely let go now of everything that's just been said. And just bring your mind into the practice. Just allow the mind and body to reach a natural place of rest. There's no need to try and make your mind a certain way. So try and force it to relax. Just receive it. Whatever you're experiencing, it's giving you direct insights into the state and nature of your mind. So there is no such thing as a bad or wrong state of mind, insofar as it all can play a role in your own development of self-knowledge. So just gently bring your attention to the breath. No need to force the attention. But set your intention to, each time the mind wanders, just bring it back to whatever it is you were doing. And now, bring your mind into the imagination and imagine yourself standing in a wide open outdoor space. In your hands, you are holding the seed. This is a symbolic representation of the elements or manifestation that you chose earlier. Examine the seed more closely. Noticing its appearance, any salient details. Feeling its weight, texture. And is it dynamic or static? There's no need to think about what it might mean. It may indeed be clear or obscure. Either way, just examine it for now. And when you're ready, plant the seed in the ground. Nurture the seed and help it grow. Watch as the seed develops and forms. What becomes of this seed? What does it grow into? It might be a person, some other living creature or mythical being, or a symbolic object. Just allow this image the freest possible play without losing the inspiration of the seed. Again, just observe the symbol in front of you. Noticing its appearance, demeanor, and its expression towards you. You're now going to engage in a two-way interaction with this symbol. You might start by just introducing yourself, asking it to introduce itself. You might ask what it represents in your life. You might ask what it means for you and what its needs are. What lesson does it have for you? Take the next minute or two to engage with this symbol. And just allow it to express itself however it needs to. But feel free to ask questions, express your own needs and position. You might interact also physically. Perhaps touch it, shake hands with it, or even meditate together with it. See if between you can cultivate a reconciliation. So take some time now to engage with this symbol however you need to. So as this interaction draws to a close, thank the symbol, wish it farewell, don't worry if you didn't feel like you got to the bottom of the issue. Know that you can always return and continue engaging with the symbol as a way to both integrate it and cultivate a relationship with it. So just allowing the scene to fade now. Bringing your attention back to the space around you. And opening your eyes again in your own time. So well done. Hope you found that nourishing and productive. I'll just end here by saying that even if you didn't feel like you achieved a full reconciliation, that's okay, right? Robert Johnson actually talked about 3 kinds of active imagination. The first one being merely what he called a horse trade. So even though the aim is to synthesize in this Hegelian way to try and achieve that, the truth that underpins both of your positions and the transcendent way forward, like Jung's transcendent function, same idea. That is not always possible. If we want it to always happen, that's really a desire to actually avoid the work. Because whether we want to do things very, very quickly, or whether we want to not do things at all and just be passive, either way, there's a kind of self-avoidance there. So the way forward is that middle way. That is the way to self-knowledge. But even if you didn't achieve a synthesis there, you can always do what's called, in Johnson's words, a horse trade. This is really like a temporary compromise where we concede a little. We say, okay, look, I'll give you what you need for now. We need to take some practical solution here for the short term, but do that with an aim to keep working with it. Right? It's a process and there's many, many layers to it. So don't feel like you have to get everything done right now. So the second type that Johnson refers to is the sort of the core of our practice, the core of our aim, and that is to achieve that reconciliation, to move through and resolve that particular issue. There's also a third kind, and this is the more spontaneous kind. This can be a very numinous experience that seemingly comes out of nowhere. Nothing comes out of nowhere, of course, but it can certainly seem that way to the conscious mind. So just to say that can happen. In fact, it would seem that Jung's first ever written account of an active imagination was an example of that for him. It sort of just happened. He was at his desk and he just submitted to it. Most of the time, we're going to be doing this in a more structured way. So the aim is to achieve a reconciliation, but if you need to, at the very least, see if you can achieve a horse trade in the short term, rather than just give up. See if you can make a little bit of ground as a foundation for further genuine reconciliation with the unconscious material. So for now, I'll leave that there. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you in part 4.